All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Kim Wallace, and I have the pleasure of working in the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement at Kenyon. And I'm so excited today for some illustrious alumni to join us and to share their experience working with nonprofit boards. And so I have the pleasure of introducing Chip Burke, class of 1983, who will serve as our moderator. Chip is the chairman of the Grable Foundation, a local family foundation in Pittsburgh dedicated to improving the lives of children. And Chip has done an array of other things in the nonprofit sector, so I will let him speak a bit more about his involvement, but we are excited for Chip and our other panelists to join us.
Thank you, Kim. I'm flattered to be asked, and it's nice to have just met Lisa and Robin virtually, my fellow panelists. Yes, I serve with the Grable Foundation, and through that work, since we're focused on underprivileged children, I served on a number of nonprofit boards, primarily originally focused on children, and then over my career also transitioned to a couple of boards that had less to do with my work and more my passion, such as running. And so I was on the Three Rivers Marathon Board, as well as a local park and arts organization. So I've had sort of some work-related boards as well as some just hobby-related boards, and both have been very fulfilling. I would like to introduce first Robin Salomon, who owns Skyline LLC, a developer of affordable housing with interest in roughly 5,000 rental units in a variety of states. And Robin, could you talk a little bit about your board experience?
Yes, thanks, Chip. Nice to meet you. I've mostly focused on community-based nonprofits versus larger nonprofits. Not to say one's better than the other, of course, but dealing generally with either the arts or low-income families and at-risk girls. In one particular case, we were just talking about how the world is very different in the pandemic for low-income families versus more affluent families. I'm also on the board of McDaniel College, so I've learned an awful lot. Where my son went to McDaniel College, where I've learned an awful lot about higher ed and the crazy way higher ed works and the finances works, which has been very interesting. But McDaniel also focuses unusually on children with kids with learning disabilities, which aren't really disabilities, but differences. And they've got maybe the gold standard in the country on dealing with first generation kids and kids with learning differences. I appreciate you all joining today.
Thank you, Robin. And I'd also like to introduce Lisa Wood, who is a partner at the law firm of Foley Hogue, LLP. And she serves on a number of boards and has served on a number of boards, some legal related and others. Lisa, would you just give us a little background on your board experience?
Sure. So I've worked as a lawyer in a large law firm my whole career, but I've always been active in nonprofit work as a way to kind of work with others who aren't lawyers to have that experience and pursue some topics that I wouldn't be able to pursue in my day job. So at the beginning of my career, I focused largely on anti-poverty issues through the lens of lawyers serving the legal needs of the poor. And I served on a bunch of different boards that related to that, culminating in serving on a national policy board that developed policy for how to better serve the legal needs of those who can't afford a lawyer. But after like 25 years of doing that, I realized I wanted to work on anti-poverty issues in a different way. And also my whole career, because I graduated Kenyon in '81, and I have often, at the beginning of my career, I was often the only woman in the room, given the kind of work I do. And I was really interested in the advancement of women in business. So what I've been doing for the last 8 years is serving on the board of a nonprofit that helps, it deals with anti-poverty from my perspective. It helps women from economically disadvantaged communities start businesses and then help grow them. And I became the chair of the board in January of 2020. We had a brand new CEO, and then 3 months later, the pandemic hit. So it's been really interesting. But our work, the Small Business Administration, ended up being very interested in what we were doing, and small businesses were hit very hard by the pandemic. So ironically, our budget tripled during the pandemic because of special funding from the Small Business Administration. But So I've kind of, my nonprofit world has focused on anti-poverty, which isn't something I do in my day job. And so that's sort of how I've had a minor in my life, is just to try to find a way to be committed to that through nonprofit work.
Terrific. As a format, I thought Lisa, Robin, and I sort of through email have gone over some questions. Some are very basic and we can probably go through them fairly quickly, and some are a little bit more complicated, and spend maybe about a half hour just sort of going through these questions, and then leave plenty of time for questions and answers. And so I think I'll start off with the basic one, which is why serve? And some of us have alluded to it already, but why do you serve on nonprofit boards?
It's interesting. I didn't grow up in a family with a lot of service background, frankly, at all, which was too bad. 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago, I started serving. It's you hear this all the time. It's remarkably satisfying to give back, either financially or with your time, or both. A side benefit is, particularly with the downfall of local news, at least in terms of community-based activities, been able to get very engaged in local issues, without just doing fundraising or meeting your local councilman or whatever silly stuff, is to actually understand the nitty-gritty of issues, at least in certain areas, particularly through a group that I used to chair, dealing with at-risk girls, 4th through 12th grade, very low-income kids who are on free or reduced meals. I'm in Montgomery County, Maryland. By the way, I graduated in '80 from Kenyon. Montgomery County, Maryland is one of the richest counties in the country, top 5 or 6. Huge divide in our county between rich and poor. And so seeing how other families who aren't as fortunate as I am, and my kids are, how their lives are impacted by the pandemic, how they're treated by the system in our allegedly progressive county has been really eye-opening. And so to be, as a result of that, and seeing how these kids are treated, I've started a nonprofit venture dealing with the achievement gap, but it's really by being engaged in a community-based nonprofit that I've learned issues that I would not read about in the metro section of the Washington Post, say, or local news. And there isn't much else available to learn about what's going on at the nitty-gritty level. It's terribly important. I found it remarkably satisfying.
Thank you. Lisa.
Sure. So I actually come from a family in public service, and then I chose to be a lawyer in a large law firm, which is different, a different path. So doing nonprofit board work was a way for me to continue to serve in a different capacity than I do in my day job. And I alluded to this in my opening remarks. I think it's a great way. I think it's important, whatever job you have, to make sure you are connected with people outside of your work, just to see how other people do problem solving and how they resolve issues. It's just interesting. I think if I spent all my time with lawyers, I'd have kind of a siloed view of the world. So this is a way to make sure I don't get stuck in that silo. So sort of for my own professional development, I thought it was important. And some of my best friends I've made through nonprofit board service, other people committed to the same cause that come from all walks of life and all parts of the country. So I've just found it stimulating for that reason. I think, as you've heard from all of us, we are all actually trying to change things that aren't right in our country. And this is one way to do it. An important part, I don't know, we certainly don't have statistics for this meeting, but the nonprofit community is a very important part of how we make change in the United States. So,
Agreed. Thank you. And I fully agree with you on the service aspect. And I find it so rewarding to work with a group often that you never knew before around a common goal that tries to do better. And regardless of whether that's building a park or saving kids, I think that can be wonderful. The other tangential benefit that I found was, if you have friends that are like you, sometimes bringing them on a board, especially if you have a busy life, gives you a chance socially to see them in a way that you would not otherwise. So that's just something. Mm-hmm. What kind of due diligence, and this came from Lisa, and I think it's an excellent question, should you do before joining a board?
So I'll give a couple suggestions, and everyone approaches this differently, but when you become a board member of a nonprofit board, you're a fiduciary for the organization. So before you take on that responsibility, I think you want to understand a little bit about how the organization is run, what its finances are. Every nonprofit of a certain size has to file an informational tax return called a 990. And so if you're thinking about going on a board, you could ask to look at copies of their last several 990s and get a sense of how they're doing financially. And those are also available on the web if you want to just do some diligence even without speaking to the nonprofit. And then I think it makes sense to talk to a couple board members and find out, why are they serving and how much time do they spend on it and how does it work and how does the board get along? What's their view of the people running the nonprofit, the management? I think we'll talk about it later. There's a big difference between serving on a small nonprofit when as a board member, you're actually helping run the organization because it has limited staff, or being on the board of a large national nonprofit that has professional staff and you as a board member might be brought on for specific skills or resources that you have. So, being a trustee of Kenyon versus being the board member of a startup nonprofit is a very different experience. But in both cases, you want to check the organization out and make sure that if you take on the responsibility as a board member, that you're comfortable with that responsibility and that you enjoy the people.
Thank you. And Robin?
I agree with everything Lisa said. The 990 is useful. It's not a be all and end all, but at least tells you before you join. The board members may give you a happy story about how they're doing, and the 990 might tell you that they're broke. It's not to say you shouldn't serve, but at least you can keep your eyes open. I like to talk to people at nonprofits in the same space who aren't on the nonprofit that you're being asked to serve on, just to get more of a reality check. It's also good to know what they expect of you. Are you being asked to join just to write checks? I stay away from those nonprofits because I'd like to be more involved instead of just writing a check. Is there a skill set they're looking for from you? I have a business background and a finance background, and so I find in the nonprofits I'm part of them, my skill set isn't replicated very often on nonprofit boards. Lots of lawyers. Nothing against lawyers, Lisa. But what is it that you're bringing that they think that you can offer beyond just writing a check? It's interesting.
I just wanted to add one area because the best boards I've served on have excellent leadership, and the worst boards I've served on have poor staff leadership. And if you have poor staff leadership, your experience can be really miserable. You kind of want to have a very secure executive director who you believe will stay in the job and also is a good leader, because tasks that should be handled by the executive director, if they're weak, can fall to the board in a way that's not appropriate. So I think that's if you can do some due diligence around the staff leadership, that is the only thing I would add to all of the other excellent suggestions. Lisa, I think this is a great question. And Robin, it seems like you might be able to talk about sort of the difference of like a board that you kind of you had a startup board or organization, and did you create that board and form it?
So I decided, it's interesting you say that, Chip. I decided not to create a nonprofit. When you create your own nonprofit, you have legal work, you have to file 990, so they're accounting. I talked to someone I know who runs the Community Foundation in our metropolitan area, which is a nationwide group with bunches of affiliates. Lots of people start nonprofits for good reasons. A lot of people do it because they want to have their name sort of on the door. It's my nonprofit. From service on another group, I learned about the terrible achievement gap in our county. And so rather than start a nonprofit, I went to organizations that are nonprofits that I know and trust that can provide the services. And so I organized the services and the nonprofits to work in this program to provide testing for low-income families and then advocacy before the county that low-income families can't afford and go after the county in some ways. And it seems to work without setting up a brand new structure that's time consuming and expensive. It could be when it grows enough, we're going to follow these kids from 4th grade through 12th grade, and the cost will accelerate as you continue to do testing and you bring more kids in. We may need to set up a nonprofit, but I chose not to, just because I think we can accomplish the mission without a separate structure.
So is that just simply you sort of controlling it and then hiring who needs to be?
And because they're nonprofits involved, one of them is the focal point of the dollars. So the dollars go into the nonprofit.
Yeah,
It's deductible. The bills from the various entities go to that nonprofit, and they pay the bills. There's a deduction, of course, for me.
Right.
So on. But I don't need to worry about bylaws and a new structure. It may change. It could be fundraising is needed in the future, and I will set up a new entity. But at the moment, if I can accomplish a goal without a new structure, then why bother? Just so I can tell people I set up a nonprofit,
No, that makes total sense. And then you don't have to, I mean, there's a lot to go with a board. And then McDaniel College, is that an example of sort of being staff run and you provide policy oversight and also, make a donation? Is that?
They clearly want donations, and small colleges fill large boards because they can't they can't invite you to the University of Michigan, Ohio State game and sit next to the president. So lots of board members. It's interesting, and every nonprofit I've served on, including McDaniel College, there's a unique inability to think strategically out 5 or 10 years. I find all the nonprofits I'm part of, in part because they're understaffed, including the college, they're doing current events and they're dealing with squeaky wheel issues. And I found in each nonprofit I'm part of, I'm pushing for and receiving a bit of reluctance and resistance, some more, some less, to stop talking about current events. I'm a board member. I don't care about today's crisis unless the world is ending. Generally, the world doesn't end that often. How are we dealing with 5 years from now? And asking the question of, is there a model that shows where we're going in 5 years? The answer is almost always no. And I find that really interesting, whether it's a sophisticated institution like a college or a very small nonprofit. The one entity I found, tiny nonprofit, they were ready to think 5 years out. Everyone else is a bit of resistance, and even in the college, which I'm embarrassed about, and certainly colleges, Kim can talk to this, have had lots of issues lately. But if you don't stay focused on 5 years out and allocating resources to those 5 years, you're really kind of chasing your tail all the time. Lisa, you probably run into this, and Chip, you have too, where nonprofits, they don't have enough staff, and they're dealing with the crisis of the day. Doesn't matter what their job descriptions are, they kind of do everything.
I get that. And Lisa, this was your question. I thought it was excellent, but again, just talking about the difference between a sort of grassroots startup, small nonprofit versus a larger community nonprofit or possibly a college or museum. And could you sort of delineate? Because I think they are clearly different roles.
Very, very different. And I use the example of, am I going to be licking envelopes? I mean, am I really going to be like just helping day to day keep the organization alive? Or am I going to be more, to Robin's point, being on a strategic planning committee and helping come up with the 5 to 10 year plan? And there's satisfaction with both. They're just very different and call for different skills. In our own family, my husband formed a nonprofit because we'd been going down through our church to Haiti to volunteer for many years. And we ultimately formed a nonprofit, which we ended up winding down, but it ran at first a health clinic, and then also we built a vocational school. And this was we got friends to contribute, and this was really there was hardly any staff. And it was a way for us to raise money and then do important things in Haiti, which is in desperate need. But it's really hard to run a small nonprofit like that. And we ultimately got some of our programs adopted by Partners in Health because they respected what we were doing. And it made more sense for a larger organization to be trying to oversee, because with a volunteer board and then limited staff, it's kind of hard to run a school and a health clinic. But that's an example of a grassroots, and that's something we did. And, it was satisfying, but hard. And then on the other, I talked about in my intro, I ended up being on the board of a national policy organization that had I don't know, like professional staff of 25, including people whose job it was just to write speeches for me and help us come up with standards. And so I got as board chair to testify in Congress and speak to judges around the country and oversee the development of standards for language access in our courts and a lot of interesting policy issues that I never would have been able to do if it was one of those grassroots boards, because I wouldn't have had time, because I do have a full-time job that's pretty demanding. But it was very exciting to bring my communication skills and my strategic planning to this professional staff and work together with them. And there were some advantages to me being a spokesperson as a corporate lawyer on these poverty law issues that if it had been a poverty advocate speaking, the judges frankly wouldn't have taken them as seriously, tragically. But so there was a way for us to partner together, but that's the other extreme. And same, it depends on the size of a college, but most large universities have professional staff, and what you're doing as a board member is serving on a committee, and you're going to be provided with resources to help you figure out what's going on. But there's no judgment. They're all different and require different skills, but that's one of the things you want to figure out and maybe you want to try both, because you can learn something from both, from the other people on the board and the staff.
I fully agree. I've had the opportunity to both be on a startup board and larger boards, and I've had good and bad experiences on both sides. A grassroots startup board, if you have a good leader identified and they can use your time wisely, because they will use your time, that can be a buzz because you're creating something and maybe that will grow into something bigger. But if they are a bad leader, they will suck your time like nothing else. And that's sort of part of the due diligence. And Robin, going back to those boards where they like you to write checks, I think the best boards get your involvement beyond the check, but sometimes they just do nothing but show up, do a dog and pony show. You don't even see finances, and you can walk away really dissatisfied because that was the only reason you were asked to be on that board. And that's, I think, probably the most dissatisfying of all, especially when you learn after the board meeting that all sorts of things that should be revealed aren't, because the staff's covered it over. So that can happen. That's part of the due diligence process. So
you're absolutely right. I won't serve if all they want is checks. And I've quit a board where that was where I was, because that's just not what
I did the same. But I have nothing against major institutions because they need, and I'm fortunate that I know some people that are connected, but as long as they engage you properly, and I think, and that leads to the next question, because what do you think sort of as a board member you should be giving to a board? And the first thing I think, I do think whatever you're capable of, but you should expect to make a financial contribution. I'm not saying the amount, but I think it's really best practice that everybody contribute in some way financially. And obviously people have different means, but I think that most nonprofit boards need to raise money. And I think if the board's not giving, then it's hard to ask other people to give. But what are some other elements beyond financial that you think you should be doing as a good board member?
I've found, as I mentioned earlier, because I'm outside Washington, D.C., we have a lot of lobbyists and lawyers on boards. Again, nothing against lobbyists and lawyers, but you'd like to have a diversity of people, of course. That long-term budgeting, not to do the budgeting, of course, but to try and get them to think 5 years out. It'd be better to think 10 years out, but that's not realistic. And so I find myself, not by design, as I said, but by accident in every nonprofit, including the college, is how can I get you all to think 5 years out? And sometimes that's a relatively easy process in one case, and then sometimes it takes years to get people to focus on. I understand somebody's complaining, let's allocate resources, but are those towards our goals or not? And so I find that's where I'm useful. I'm not always listened to, but I can be useful.
In the board that I'm on right now that I chair, I have a great CEO, very talented in the organization, and we we, through the governance committee, look at how are the board members engaged, and we do a grid, both what skills are they bringing to the board, how many meetings are they attending, what is their financial contribution? Because we try to think strategically, where do we have holes? Where is someone not engaged, where we could improve, get them more engaged? Maybe they haven't been invited to be on a committee. But I think if you're going to serve on a board, you do want to make a financial commitment that's commensurate with your resources, and that the organization has been clear about what the expectation is. But you also want to spend time. You want to go to board meetings and be prepared, and then be on at least a committee where you're contributing some skills to help the board function and help the organization function. And, a well-run board, I think, is going to really have different board members on different committees, and have each committee have actually something real to do that advances the goals of the organization and makes a difference. And sometimes you can also get involved in the organization. If you're interested in working with kids, you might even be able to volunteer and get to see how the organization works in the community. So that can be fun too. But the one thing I would add on the financial contribution, I think we're getting a lot better as a community of understanding the importance of diversity in a board. So not expecting everyone is going to come in and make a major financial contribution, because that would reduce the diversity on the board, but recognizing that people can contribute in a variety of ways. But foundations and others who might give money to a board, to a nonprofit, aren't going to if the board isn't giving at the 100, that 100% of the board isn't giving in some way. So you really, if you're not willing to make that commitment, then a foundation or other source of funding may not be willing to either. So you're doing a real disservice to the organization if you don't contribute in some way.
And it shows a weakness of the board if 100% of the people are not giving something. Again, it doesn't have to be the top, but they should be committed in many ways. And to me, that's just a red flag that there's something wrong if people are just sitting in chairs.
I fully agree. And I think when foundations are approached, especially for major capital campaigns or projects, it's always very impressive if the board's made a significant gift as the first gift to the campaign. And it can be collective, but if it's a $15 million campaign and somebody approaches a foundation and says the board's contributed already $2 million towards it, I think that's a real 100% commitment, regardless of resource. And obviously it would be diverse gifts, but 100% commitment and a $2 million lead really helps sell that, I think, to foundations in a good way. And Lisa, I want to highlight what you said. I think time is really important if you join a nonprofit board. You have to be prepared to show up at meetings and do at least one committee work, I think. I think there's nothing more disheartening than to go to a board meeting where they struggle to get quorums because the board members aren't showing up. And quorum usually is 50%. I think the strongest boards have like 90% to 100% participation. And if there are too many meetings that people can't make, then the board should think through a way to assure greater attendance.
It raises sort of a secondary issue, Chip, which is particularly if you become chair, and I've chaired a couple of nonprofits, is when is the right time to tell board members to move on?
Yeah.
If they're just
and I think good leadership does that. And
Yeah.
I think sometimes if board members aren't showing up, that sometimes they're relieved to have that conversation because they're feeling guilty, they just couldn't do it, or things. So I bet a lot of people just let them go and not show up for years. And I think that can be the worst.
No, it's again indicative of a problem.
Yeah, I agree. So we talked about the benefits of serving. What would be some reasons not to serve on a nonprofit board?
I joined a board because I respected the executive director, but I found myself not really interested in their mission. They have a perfectly good mission, but it wasn't important to me. And I felt bad leaving, but if I wasn't going to be committed, I wasn't really helping them at all. So I left. And so it has to do something to you inside where you feel motivated versus you like the people or something, which was my mistake in this one organization. Perfectly lovely organization. It just wasn't my thing.
Lisa, any thoughts?
Yeah. I was on a board once of an organization that turned out to not be managing its finances well. And it took a while to figure that out. But once I figured that out, I wasn't really interested in continuing to be on the board because I didn't feel that we had a plan for getting out of it and there hadn't been transparency. So then I thought, wow, I don't think I want to be associated with this organization. So I don't want to freak anyone out because that's not like that happens all the time. But I don't think you want to continue to serve on an organization if you feel like you're not getting accurate information or people are mishandling funds. Now some personalities would say, well, there's an opportunity for me to fix something, get the board together and fix a problem. And I respect that, but it wasn't a burden that I wanted to take on in that instance. So I got off the board.
I think those are all good reasons. So I think just to sort of recap, because we've touched on it a lot, but it can be a horrible experience if the board's not the right fit. So I think, Robin, earlier you said if they just want to check and you don't feel like your skills are being used in a way that you want, I think poor leadership, lack of transparency, and that can be in the due diligence process. I think those are all excellent things. And I think, we are all committed. And Lisa, what you said is you might have the personality of trying to fix something. I would be very leery of that. I've tried that where people said, wait, I think you have the skill set to do that. I've gotten on the board. It's really hard to change a culture by yourself. And even if they've invited you to do that. So just be leery. I think I've covered most of our questions. Before I open up to questions and answers to the group, Lisa and Robin, do you have anything else you would like to add that I might have missed in covering?
No, I think Lisa and I and you, Chip, would agree. If it's the right fit, it can be a terribly rewarding experience and opens up doors to other things you would not run into in your normal life, and that's very rewarding.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm very glad that I had a mentor early on in my career who suggested I do this, and I've never really looked back. I just keep serving. I really enjoy it. But I want to make sure that we respond to your questions, folks, and also that we don't suggest that being on a board is necessarily problematic or huge time.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I just wanted people to be aware of that because I find it the most rewarding thing you can do. I honestly, and the people I've met through nonprofit service, it's just so rewarding and continue to be friends to this day. So I just always wanted to. So I'm sorry if I focused on problem issues because there's no greater buzz than achieving something together that nobody could achieve on their own. So, thank you. So questions?
Do we just jump in the questions? Is that okay?
Please do. It's nice to meet you. Hi.
Awesome. Hi, my name's Jenny Dillon. I graduated from Kenyon in 2010.
Wow.
I am currently a member of a local junior league organization. I would consider a small grassroots type step. Because of COVID, well, a little bit before COVID, but we recently pretty radically changed how we run, implementing a board and management structure. But it's the type where members are on the management team, and then we jump up to board level. I'm not there yet, but I think I'll be there within a couple of years. So in terms of one of the things we struggle with is engagement of members. We've got kind of a core group of people that are really enthusiastic, really involved, and that are keeping us going. And I am one of those people. So what does a good leader do in order to, encourage participation monetarily or not, because we have members of a variety of backgrounds, to ensure that, we are meeting our goals in 5 or 10 years. Do you guys have any thoughts or suggestions on that?
It's interesting what you say, Jenny. My experience has been, including at a college level, is if you can get a third of the board really interested and engaged, you've kind of hit maybe a home run, where people are all desperately engaged and wanting more. And then other people are there and they need to be asked. And then often they'll respond, but they need to be asked, not because they are the kind of personality that needs to be asked. It's just maybe they're not forthcoming as a personality. And some community nonprofits, what we've done is something called a friend raiser, where you're not inviting your friends to a fundraiser, but you get to meet, in the one case, this at-risk girls group, you get to meet some of the young women, and you get a few board members to do this jointly, so that this person who maybe wants to be engaged, doesn't know how to be engaged, can join with other board members, a handful of them, to put on an event, as an example, versus having that, just asking that person to dive in, and they maybe aren't that kind of personality, but maybe with 2 or 3 other board members, especially if that person knows 1 or 2 others, and doing some event together. I'm just mentioning a friend raiser, but it could be anything. Because I think and I'd be curious what Lisa and Chip think. My experience has been, if you get a third really engaged, you've done well, which is too bad, because then you're losing 2/3 in terms of their active participation.
Robin, I would just, I fully agree. A third is fair, but there's a way to work around that too, because there are different levels of involvement. I served on my local public school board, and we functioned really well. And I think it was because the levels of engagement were different. It was a 9-person board, and I would say there were sort of 3 leaders on the board that kind of dealt with a lot of the issues, and they sort of rotated chairmanship of the board. Oh, I served for 12 years over that period. And then there were 2 real worker bees that served on committees and did some of the grunt work. Like, they also had to serve on a secondary nonprofit board at the local vocational school that nobody really wanted to do, but they loved it. But they weren't really the leadership, but they took care of that. We had one woman that never showed up, but she always voted correctly. And she also sort of was our eyes and ears to the community. And then we had 2 people that just wanted to be there and show up at the meetings. And so they weren't all involved at a high level. But I think good leaders, like if you had 9 people, we would have butted heads, like highly involved, we would have butted heads a lot more. So sometimes you can use that lack of involvement, as long as you can engage them in some way, to your advantage.
I agree with you, Chip. You don't want 100% leadership, but to Jenny's point, you want to find a way. I know you agree with this, to get those people more engaged versus being passive.
Absolutely.
I think the key is to be intentional about engagement. So, have one-on-one conversations with the people in leadership to find out how do they want to be engaged. And people like to be asked this, and you find out kind of what they're prepared for. And some people will be at a point in their lives when they can't spend as much time or as much money now, but maybe they will later. So you get them involved at a lower level. And the same with member engagement. I think, I've been in lots of different organizations where the financing is through dues. So you need member engagement because you need the dues and you need a lot of members. So you've got to have programming that's specifically targeted at member engagement. And there may be a committee of the board with staff that focuses on that. But at the board level, being intentional about it, to me, has, in my various experience, that's been the most effective. And just asking people. And if you don't ask, you won't know. And people sometimes are just waiting to be asked. They're very deferential. They're new to the board. They can't figure out, like, what am I supposed to say something? Am I supposed to sit here? So some people need to be kind of goosed along to participate, but they're thrilled when they're asked. So I just think that's an important part of the process.
Thank
Great.
you.
Question in the chat.
Yep. If you have a lower income but are passionate about serving on a board, how can you position yourself as a good candidate for one? That's an excellent question.
So what I found that's interesting is, particularly at the small community nonprofits, you have a variety of incomes from board members. And so there may be a requirement to give, but it could be a give or get. And if the board is smart, they don't require everyone to write a check necessarily, But if they can bring in their circle of friends or colleagues from work and raise a few dollars to meet whatever the minimum threshold is, that's very successful. And any, at least small nonprofit, maybe even a big one, they want to expand their circle of contacts. And so though you can't write $1 million check, and most everybody can't, you can bring in your circle of contacts and raise some money. And a smart nonprofit would be thrilled to have that experience.
Right. So when you put together your board bio or the pitch for why you make a contribution to the board, you just want to think about, what do you bring? Is it a community of potential members that are going to get active, that aren't active now, and the organization needs to reach that community? Or is it, you could have a group of folks that will give money, or maybe you have connections to an organization that the nonprofit needs to get involved with. There's all different kinds of angles. And boards are much more focused now than they were 20 years ago about having a diverse board. So you can poke around too and sort of find out how does the organization, what is it looking for, and does it have a broad view. And that from, to other people on the board, you can find out what are ways that you could contribute. So then you can come up with what your what you offer.
And just going back to Jenny, if there are ways to get involved to show your worth to the organization, like the Junior League, where she's serving on a committee with the aim to get on the board, that's a great way. If they need something, or if they're throwing the local fundraiser and you can get on a committee to sort of help with that and just show your worth that way, would be another way. Other questions?
Can I get through here?
Yes, hello?
Can you all hear me?
I can?
Awesome. Okay. Sorry, I'm commuting.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Saskia, class of 2010 as well. I asked the last question, and if nobody else has anything, I have a few follow-ups.
Please.
Okay. How do you, this is sort of along the road, but I work for the African Wildlife Foundation, and there is a lot of discord between the board and financial priorities with the realities of donor correspondence. And I think that one of the things that would make me an excellent candidate for a board is being able to bring that perspective and suggestions about how to work on that, how to improve not just diversity, but a sense of belonging and accommodation of different gender identities, different mental health statuses. But I don't know exactly how to communicate that to people who are in a position to make a difference. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great, what I would recommend you do is talk to people that do some informational interviews with people that are on nonprofit boards, and maybe even you try this out, not with the board you're hoping to get on, but some other people, whether Kenyon alums or other people, and just see if they can help you through conversation, kind of hone the value that you would bring. That would be one way. I mean, I think it's an underutilized skill, is to ask to speak to people and get their advice. You'd be how willing most people are to talk to you when you've got such a laudatory goal of serving organizations. And, then you get outside of your usual suspects of friends and colleagues and talk to someone else, you might learn something, and you just, all you have to do is ask.
Okay. All right, thank you.
If you have a mentor in your organization who could point you in a direction, not outside of your area, but who can coach you a little bit, I know my daughter took a job in Richmond, and her boss sat her down and said, in Richmond, people serve. And so you have to pick a nonprofit. We don't care which one, or I can guide you. But when you go into a meeting, people will ask you, where are you serving? And that was a great entree. So maybe your mentor could help you to point you in the right direction, or how to promote your skill set.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Because we're an international organization, we don't have the same opportunities for committees and donors and other people who would like to serve in some way but don't have the option. So I'm woefully ignorant about how to do that at nonprofits that do have those opportunities, and I'd really love to. So thank you.
Any other questions? You guys shouldn't be bashful. You see, we answer all the questions.
I'll hop in with another one. For all three of you, what are, in terms of longer term planning, the 5 years, the 10 years, like Robin mentioned, organizations that are successful, what are the types of things that they're planning for in the long term?
It's different with each group, of course. I found at the college, for instance, deferred maintenance. Kenyon's got old buildings, like at most every college. Are they putting Band-Aids on buildings that have issues, infrastructure issues, or is it worth just thinking long-term, and maybe whatever is broken needs to be fixed instead of continually doing Band-Aids? And that's sort of a microcosm of the thinking. Is there's a crisis, a bunch of parents, a bunch of students, someone is complaining and throwing money at things to quiet the issue or deal with the squeaky wheel. It's much better to have a longer term set of goals. A nonprofit I was chair of, this is the best experience I had at sitting down with the executive director and said, we serve these girls, low income in X schools. How do we double that in 5 years? And she just jumped at it. I find in the other nonprofits I serve on, I'm too busy, I'm chasing my tail. They don't say it in these words, but in effect, they're saying, I can't do that. I've got too much going on. And as a board member, to force the leadership, if you can, to think long-term, or maybe you need different leadership. And in some cases, it's very straightforward that you can start that process. At the college I'm part of, I've been on 8 years, and I think I'm finally getting traction. And it just depends. But it's setting goals. They're all different, of course, but it makes me a little bit crazy, to be honest with you, to deal with the squeaky wheel. Squeaky wheel isn't squeaking anymore. Declare victory and wait for the next squeaky wheel.
I think it's worth, it depends, but going through a strategic planning exercise, when you bring people from outside the organization who maybe are in the same space, mission-based, or bring other skills, and having a committee that actually takes the organization through a strategic planning process. Now, I have to admit, I've been through several that weren't well run. And so the last thing I want to do is sit through another naval contemplation exercise that produces nothing. But if it's well done and the people at the table are the right people, it can be transformative, and it helps deal with the reluctance of the staff to get to put their head up and stop dealing with the day-to-day problems and think about the future. And sometimes you get feedback about how you're doing this organization from others that you wouldn't have heard otherwise. So it's one way to do it. But there's all kinds of, there's deferred maintenance, there's, the pet peeve of mine is looking at where do we get our funds and what are the risks of having all our funds come from one source, whether it's running a gala every year, which takes a ton of time and is hard, really, is that the best way to raise funds? Or if you have a lot of government money, that's a scary thing because, the government who runs it changes, and we're in such a contentious time in our country that being 100% dependent on government funds would be nerve-wracking. So there's all different kinds of things to be thinking about when you think long-term, but those are some examples.
And Lisa's right. There are strategic planning exercises where you just want to bang your head against the wall. And there's some, it's what really determines it, I think, at least has a large role in success, is does the chair and the executive director, or in the case of a college or president, are they committed to long-term thinking? And if they're not, then as Lisa said, it's navel gazing. I read in Trusteeship, a magazine for board trustees of colleges, or Kenyon's immediate past president is in another institution now, and she doesn't want to do strategic planning. It's just a process that gets ignored. And I'm paraphrasing a quote of hers. We just set goals and we try and accomplish them. And that might be the right approach if she's committed to it, and the board chair is. If they're not committed to it, that's a place where you could maybe affect change. But it can be a harder process. And strategic planning may be the right way if it's done the right way. And if it has the wrong people, then it's just a thing to put on the shelf. And if there was one way to do this, you could patent it and make a lot of money maybe. But I found it really, if the current leadership isn't engaged in it, it's just hard to get long-term thinking.
Other
The other
questions?
A
Oh,
is
good.
the it's maybe not squeaky wheel, but ask lots of questions at board meetings. If things don't seem right, or don't be afraid to push when you don't, because you're there for a reason. You've been invited to be a caretaker for the organization. So if it looks like 3 years down the road there's going to be a financial problem, or it's going to be hard to continue, or there's something going on with the mission, the world has changed dramatically just like the last 2 years. Do we need to tweak the mission in order to still be relevant, or have we based our programming on some false assumptions? Don't be afraid to raise controversial questions at a board meeting. I mean, there's an art to doing that, so people don't groan when they see you coming down the hall, but you don't want to be a yes person at a board meeting. You want to ask tough questions.
Sure. Thank you.
There's a huge, not incentive, but the group likes to have things going along nicely.
Yeah.
And Lisa's right. You don't want to always be the person, and sometimes I'm guilty of this, complaining about everything. But it goes to strategic thinking. If you think we're heading in, the group is heading in the wrong direction, you're doing everyone a favor. And it might be other people are thinking the same thing, but they don't want to get in the way.
Yep.
So make sure you're substantive, you've got your facts. But that can force long-term thinking because you've identified a problem.
Are there other questions? We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to make sure I respect everybody's time.
Is Kenyon going through, Lisa? Kim, I'm sorry, a strategic planning process now? I don't know.
They actually recently completed a strategic planning process.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so it was interesting. Again, there's no right way. As the prior president doesn't think much of, at least according to this quote, and the current president does. So it really just depends what their level of commitment is. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's interesting.
So I have, this is Jason Crew. I'm class of 1994. I'm just starting to consider and explore different options for board membership. Do you have any advice for how to get started to find appropriate or find boards that are in need, as opposed to, I have a couple of ideas, but any strategies that you've used in the past?
There are, I'll just start because I've supported a couple. So if the United Way is active where you work or live, they have a board bank where boards come to them and they need board members, and they do training, and you can be on a list to get plugged in when a board is looking, and you can say what areas you're interested in. And there's probably other organizations that do that too, but there are a variety of organizations that help place board members and connect people like you who are interested in making a contribution with organizations. And then I'll go back to what I said before, just networking and talking to people to find out is another way. It's an interesting way to meet people, but it's also another way to find organizations that might jive with what your interests are.
I agree with Lisa. I think, especially if you have friends on boards. I mean, we have board match programs here in Pittsburgh, and I would just caution you to go back to Lisa's first piece. Do your due diligence at that point. because sometimes if they need board members, that may be because they're in trouble. Because the best boards recruit from within. And it's friend to friend. So you could probably find boards that are in need, but if they're advertising for board members, there's a reason usually. And the best boards have people that are looking for specific skill sets and people, and they know how to do it. So if you have friends that are on organizations that you respect, that would be a better way, in my opinion, to start marketing yourself and asking, and going back to the networking that Lisa said.
Okay.
Jason,
you
did
both.
we answer your
That's helpful.
question?
You absolutely did. Thank you very much.
The one other thing I would say, because Chip is right, the ones that need a board member, but there are exceptions to that. But most boards, they'll say who's on the board on the website of the organization, and the person in charge of nominating or governance will be identified. And, you know, if there's an organization you're interested in, don't be bashful about reaching out to the person who's in charge of governance or nominating and find out, are they looking for board members, and what do they look for, and who should you talk to? Because it's their job on the board to bring in new board members.
Most nonprofits, the two goals you have are to raise some money or give some money at a minimum. Just a bare minimum is attendance, facilitate some giving, but then replace yourself when your term is up. And so networking to your friends, or if you have mentors where you work or within your social circle, because their job should be to replace themselves. And most nonprofits will advertise that early in your tenure, that your job is, among other things, to find your own replacement. So that's just a thought.
And as you're looking, I would go with your passion. And if your passion is helping the homeless, then research those boards. If your passion is the arts, you'll be an excellent board member at that point because you're following your passion.
Thank you.
Kim, it looks like we're up against the time now, so I just want to respect everybody's time. I think we could take probably one more question if needed. Well, I want to thank both Lisa and Robin, and Kim, thank you for asking us. This has been fun. It's been fun to meet everybody virtually. I miss Kenyan people. And, you know, Lisa and Robin, I was there at the same time you were, and this is the first time I really know that I've met you. I was 2 years younger. I was class of '83, so I think
We probably bumped into each other at a frat
yeah,
party.
it was a small enough place that would happen. But thank you all. I very much enjoyed this.
Thanks for moderating, Chip.
Thank you so much, Robin and Lisa.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry. Is there a way to be in touch with you all if we have follow-up questions later?
I was going to
Sure.
say I'm happy to take emails or phone calls.
Yeah. I mean, why don't I give my email as a start? My email is chip, CHIP, at Grable, GRABLE.org. Again, chip, CHIP, at Grable, GRABLE.org.
Awesome.
I can add mine. I'll just add it to the chat, or you can contact.
Kim, do you think you could email this to everybody who
Yeah.
participated, maybe?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm
That's what
happy.
I was just, because my
Perfect.
email also, Kim can send that out.
Happy to send
That'd
that
be
out to
great.
the attendees.
Great.
Thanks. Bye-bye,
Thank you all.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
thank you.
Take care.